The envelope looked as though it had survived another lifetime. Its paper had turned yellow with age. The corners were worn and brittle. Across the front were faded postmarks from the spring of 1945, each one stamped over another as if the letter had spent decades wandering from one forgotten place to the next. When the mail carrier placed it into my hands, he smiled politely and apologized for the mistake. He had no idea that the mistake had lasted 78 years. Neither did I. At first, I assumed it belonged to someone else. The handwriting was elegant, almost impossible to read. The address no longer existed. The town had changed. Streets had been renamed. Most of the people listed on the envelope had been gone for decades. Then I noticed one name. It was my grandmother's. Not the name everyone knew. Her maiden name. The one almost nobody in our family had ever spoken aloud. My hands started trembling. She had died 15 years earlier, taking many of her stories with her. She had survived World War II, built a family, raised children and grandchildren, yet there was one chapter of her life she always refused to discuss. Whenever anyone mentioned the war, she would smile politely, excuse herself from the room, and never answer a single question. We all believed she simply wanted to forget. But as I carefully turned the envelope over, I discovered something that changed everything. The seal had never been broken. No one had ever opened it. For 78 years, that letter had traveled across countries, survived warehouses, floods, government archives, forgotten mailbags, and countless moves, waiting for someone who no longer lived to finally receive it. I never imagined that opening one old envelope would uncover a family secret buried since the final days of World War II. What I found inside forever changed the way we understood our family's history and the man we thought we had lost forever. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Whitmore. At least, that was the name everyone in our family remembered. She lived to be 94 years old. She baked cinnamon bread every Sunday morning, fed every stray cat that wandered into her yard, and never let any of her grandchildren leave her house without a hug. To us, she was simply Grandma Eleanor, the quiet woman with silver hair who always smiled whenever someone else was happy. She almost never spoke about herself. Whenever conversations drifted toward her childhood or the war years, she became strangely distant. She would quietly clear the dishes from the table, refill everyone's coffee, or suddenly remember something that needed to be done in the garden. As children, we never questioned it. As adults, we assumed she carried painful memories that were better left untouched. No one imagined those memories had been waiting inside an unopened envelope all along. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was working from home when the mail carrier knocked on my door. He apologized before handing me the envelope, explaining that it had been transferred from a postal archive after workers uncovered several forgotten mailbags during the renovation of an old government storage building. Apparently, thousands of undelivered letters from the final months of World War II had recently been recovered and sent through an extensive effort to locate surviving relatives. I almost handed it back. The recipient had died years earlier. There seemed little point in delivering a message that had missed its destination by nearly 8 decades. But the mail carrier insisted. Sometimes these belong to history more than they belong to the mail, he said before walking away. Those words stayed with me. Inside the house, I placed the envelope on the kitchen table without touching it for nearly an hour. Something about it demanded respect. The paper carried the unmistakable scent of age, mixed with dust and old ink. Every crease told a story of countless hands, warehouses, trains, ships, and forgotten shelves. I finally picked it up. The front was covered in faded postmarks from different military postal stations across Europe. Some stamps had nearly disappeared beneath layers of newer markings. Others remained surprisingly clear, showing dates from April and May of 1945, just as the war in Europe was coming to its end. Then I noticed something that made my heart race. The sender's name, Private Thomas Whitmore. I had never heard that name before, yet the last name was ours. At first I assumed it was a coincidence. Families often share surnames without being related. Still, curiosity pushed me toward the old cedar chest where my grandmother had stored generations of family photographs after my grandfather passed away. We had never sorted through everything. Life always seemed too busy, and opening those boxes felt like reopening old grief. For the first time since her funeral, I carried one of those boxes into the living room. I had no idea that buried beneath hundreds of fading photographs was the first clue that my entire family history had been missing one person all along. The cedar chest had remained untouched for nearly 15 years. After my grandmother passed away, none of us found the strength to sort through her belongings. We agreed that one day we would preserve everything properly, but like so many promises made during grief, it quietly faded into the background of everyday life. The lid groaned softly as I lifted it. Inside were hundreds of photographs, carefully wrapped in old newspapers, bundles of letters tied together with faded blue ribbons, recipe books written in delicate handwriting, and small keepsakes collected over the course of an entire lifetime. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. I searched for family albums, hoping to find the name Thomas somewhere among the familiar faces. At first, there was nothing. My great-grandparents appeared in nearly every photograph. My grandmother, as a little girl, smiled beside a white wooden fence. Christmas gatherings, birthday parties, weddings, generations of memories carefully preserved. Yet there was no Thomas. Then one photograph slipped from between the pages of an old album. It landed face down on the floor. When I turned it over, I froze. There stood my grandmother as a teenager, no older than 17. Beside her was a young soldier, wearing a United States Army uniform. They weren't simply standing together for a formal portrait. Their expressions carried something much deeper. She was looking directly at him, smiling in a way I had never seen in any other family photograph. His arm rested gently behind her back. On the bottom corner, written in fading blue ink, were just 4 words. Asterisk always waiting. Thomas. Asterisk. I stared at the photograph for several minutes. Who was he? A brother? A cousin? A childhood friend? If he had been part of our family, why had no one ever mentioned him? Turning the picture over revealed another surprise. My grandmother had written a date. March 18th, 1945. Just weeks before the war in Europe ended. My pulse quickened as I reached for the unopened envelope again. The postmark matched almost perfectly. The photograph had been taken only a short time before the letter was mailed. For the first time, the envelope no longer felt like an old piece of forgotten mail. It felt like the missing half of a conversation that had been interrupted for 78 years. Before opening it, I decided to keep searching through the chest. Something told me that my grandmother had left more than one clue behind. I was right. Hidden beneath a stack of neatly folded tablecloths rested a small leather journal. Its pages had yellowed with age. On the very first page, written in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, was a sentence that made every hair on my arms stand up. Asterisk, if this diary is ever found, it means Thomas never came home. Asterisk. I didn't open the diary immediately. Instead, I held it in both hands, wondering how many times my grandmother had done the same. The leather cover was cracked with age, softened by decades of careful use. It wasn't large, barely enough to fit inside a coat pocket, but somehow it felt heavier than anything else inside the cedar chest. When I finally opened it, the first pages were filled with ordinary life. Shopping lists, church reminders, notes about planting tomatoes, recipes copied from neighbors. For a brief moment, I thought I had imagined everything. Then the handwriting changed. The neat, confident letters became smaller, uneven, as though each word had been written while trying not to cry. The date at the top of the page read, April 2nd, 1945. My dear Thomas left this morning. That was the first sentence. Nothing more. Just those 5 words. I kept reading. She wrote that he had boarded a military transport before sunrise. They weren't married. In fact, almost nobody knew how serious their relationship had become. Wartime moved quickly, and people learned not to make promises they weren't certain they could keep. Thomas had promised only one thing. He would write. Every chance he had. According to the diary, the first letters arrived exactly as promised. One from England, another from France, a third from Belgium. Each one carried hope. Each one spoke about returning home. Each one ended with the same sentence. Asterisk, wait for me. Asterisk. Then, nothing. Weeks passed. Months. Silence replaced every promise. The war ended, but Thomas never came back. No official telegram ever arrived. No officer visited the family. No body was identified. He simply disappeared, missing in action. Those 3 words became the only explanation anyone ever received. My grandmother wrote that every afternoon she walked to the mailbox, convinced that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow became another week, then another month, then another year. People gently encouraged her to move on. Eventually she did. She met my grandfather. They built a beautiful life together, raised children, welcomed grandchildren. But one paragraph stopped me cold. I loved my husband with all my heart, but there will always be a small corner inside me that belongs to the young man who promised he would come home. I had to put the diary down. Until that moment, I had never considered that people could carry 2 different kinds of love through an entire lifetime. One fulfilled, one forever unfinished. I looked back at the unopened envelope resting on the table. If this really was one of Thomas's missing letters, it wasn't simply delayed mail. It was the final piece of a conversation my grandmother had spent 78 years waiting to finish. With trembling hands, I carefully slid a letter opener beneath the fragile seal that no one before me had ever broken. The paper crackled softly as I unfolded it. For a moment, I was almost afraid to read it. It felt wrong somehow, as though I were stepping into a conversation that had never been meant for anyone else. 78 years had passed, yet the ink remained remarkably clear. Every stroke of Thomas's handwriting looked as though it had been written only yesterday. The letter began, without ceremony, "My dearest Eleanor." Those 3 words alone explained more than anyone in my family had known for generations. They hadn't simply cared for one another. They had loved each other deeply. Thomas wrote from a small village somewhere in Western Germany during the final weeks of the war. He never mentioned exact locations, knowing military censors would remove sensitive details, but he described endless rain, abandoned farms, broken church bells, and villages where silence had replaced ordinary life. Then the tone changed. "I think this will be my last letter for a while." I stopped breathing. He explained that his unit had received unexpected orders to move before dawn. Nobody knew where they were going. Rumors spread through the camp that the fighting would soon end, but experienced soldiers no longer trusted rumors. "We all believe peace is close," he wrote. "Sometimes that makes men careless." The next paragraph felt strangely personal. "If this letter reaches you after everything is over, promise me something." I leaned closer. "Please don't spend your life waiting if I never come home." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Everything my grandmother had written in her diary suddenly made painful sense. She hadn't ignored his wish. She had honored it. She had eventually married another man, raised a family, built a beautiful life. But reading those sentences decades later, I could almost hear the heartbreak hidden beneath every word Thomas chose. Then came a passage that none of us could have anticipated. "I've enclosed something else. If it survives the journey, keep it safe. One day it may answer questions that none of us can imagine today." I looked inside the envelope again. At first, I thought it was empty. Then I noticed a second fold hidden beneath the letter itself. Carefully, I reached inside and removed a much smaller piece of paper wrapped in wax cloth. It wasn't another letter. It was a tiny black and white photograph. 3 young soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, smiling despite the exhaustion visible on their faces. Thomas stood in the center. On the back, written in pencil, were just 7 words. "If only one returns, tell our families." My stomach tightened. Who were the other 2 men? Why had Thomas carried their photograph? And why had he believed only one of them might survive? As I turned the picture toward the light, I noticed something almost invisible along the bottom edge. A name. One that did not belong to Thomas. It belonged to someone my own father had spoken about only once, many years before. A man our family believed had died decades earlier. But according to this photograph, He had been standing beside Thomas on the very day that letter was written. I spent the rest of that evening staring at the photograph. The three young soldiers looked no older than 25. Dirt covered their uniforms, but their smiles suggested they were trying to hold on to something normal in a world that had long since forgotten what normal looked like. Thomas stood in the middle. The soldier on his right had signed his first name beneath the picture. Daniel. The man on the left had not. Instead, there was only an initial.
J.
Nothing more. The handwriting matched Thomas's perfectly. If only one returns, tell our families. I couldn't stop wondering what had happened after that photograph was taken. Had only one of them survived? Had none of them? Or had someone lived long enough to carry a promise they were never able to keep? The answer seemed impossible to find. Then I remembered something my father had once mentioned years earlier. It happened after my grandmother's funeral. We had been sorting through old framed photographs when he picked up one picture, stared at it for several seconds, and quietly said, "My mother always believed someone else knew the truth." At the time, I thought he was simply grieving. Now those words suddenly carried a different meaning. The following morning I drove to my parents' house. I placed the photograph and the letter on the dining room table without saying a word. My father adjusted his glasses and picked up the picture. At first, nothing happened. Then his expression changed. He leaned closer. His hands began to tremble. "I know this face," he whispered. He pointed toward the soldier marked only with the letter J. "I've seen him before." I waited. When I was about 12, my father said slowly, "A very old man came to visit your grandmother." I had never heard this story. He stayed less than an hour. "What did they talk about?" I asked. "I don't know." "Did she ever tell you who he was?" He shook his head. "She asked me to leave the room." That alone wasn't unusual. Adults often had private conversations. But then my father remembered something that neither of us could explain. When the man left, he paused. "Your grandmother cried harder than I've ever seen in my life." Not quietly. Not a few tears. According to my father, she collapsed into a chair, holding something tightly against her chest while sobbing for nearly an hour. He had assumed someone had died. She never explained. Years later, when he asked about the visitor again, she answered with only one sentence. "Some promises arrived too late." Those exact words echoed inside my mind. Too late, just like the letter.
I showed my father the envelope.
His eyes widened immediately. He recognized the handwriting. Not because he had seen the letters before, but because, as a child, he had accidentally discovered an old wooden box hidden beneath his mother's bed. Inside were dozens of carefully folded envelopes. Every one of them carried the same handwriting, Thomas's, except they were all empty. Every letter she had ever received from him before he disappeared had vanished. Only the envelopes remained, as if someone had deliberately removed every page inside. Suddenly, the letter lying on our table became far more than a delayed message. It might be the only surviving words Thomas Whitmore had ever written. That afternoon, my father and I spread everything across the dining room table. The unopened past had become tangible. There was Thomas's final letter, the wartime photograph, my grandmother's diary, and now, a faded wooden box containing 12 empty envelopes. Each one had been addressed to Eleanor. Each one carried military postal stamps from different places across Europe.
England, France,
Belgium, Germany. The dates stretched from late 1944 until the spring of 1945. Only the paper inside was missing. Someone had carefully removed every letter while leaving the envelopes untouched. It wasn't something that happened by accident. Whoever had done it had wanted the messages to disappear, but not the evidence that they had once existed. My father turned one of the envelopes over in his hands. "I remember asking her why she kept empty envelopes," he said quietly. "What did she tell you?" He smiled sadly. "She said they reminded her that hope had once existed." Neither of us spoke for several moments. I couldn't stop imagining my grandmother opening each letter during the war, reading Thomas's words over and over again, then somehow losing every page while keeping every envelope. It made no sense, unless she hadn't lost them. Someone had taken them. That possibility refused to leave my mind. Later that evening, I drove to the County Historical Society. The small brick building stood only a few miles from the old neighborhood where my grandmother had spent most of her life. I wasn't expecting much. Perhaps an old newspaper clipping, a military record, anything connected to Thomas Whitmore. The volunteer archivist listened patiently as I explained why I had come. When I showed her the photograph, her expression changed almost immediately. "I've seen this uniform patch before," she said. She disappeared into the archive room. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a thick binder filled with military documents that had been donated by local families over the years. Most of the records listed young men who had served during World War II. Some returned home. Many never did. She slowly turned the pages until she stopped. "There," she whispered. The page contained a roster from an infantry company. 3 names had been circled decades earlier by someone using blue fountain pen. Private Thomas Whitmore. Private Daniel Mercer. Corporal James Callahan.
James.
The mysterious J. I compared the names with the photograph. Everything matched perfectly. Then I noticed a handwritten note attached to the bottom of the roster. It had been added years after the war. Whitmore, missing. Mercer, killed in action. Callahan, returned home. I looked back at Thomas's words written behind the photograph. "If only one returns, tell our families." Only one had. James Callahan. He had survived. And, according to the records, he returned to the United States in late 1945. A cold feeling settled over me. If James had survived, then he was almost certainly the elderly man who visited my grandmother decades later. The one who left her in tears. The one she never spoke about again. But one question still remained. Why had he waited so many years before finding her? And more importantly, what truth had he finally brought with him after decades of silence? I couldn't stop thinking about James Callahan. For 78 years, our family had believed Thomas had simply vanished somewhere in Europe. Yet one man had returned alive. One man had known what happened during those final days of the war. And somehow, he had carried that knowledge for decades. The archivist noticed the expression on my face. "There's something else," she said carefully. She reached beneath the roster and removed another folder that had been filed separately. Unlike the military records, these documents had been donated by local veterans after the war. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, meeting programs, letters from annual reunions. Most of them honored soldiers who had survived and returned home. Then she stopped at a brittle newspaper dated October 1983. The headline immediately caught my attention. Local World War II veteran returns to Europe after 38 years. The article was about James Callahan. It described him as a quiet man who rarely spoke about combat. According to the reporter, James had refused nearly every interview throughout his life. But shortly after retiring, he decided to revisit several places where his infantry company had fought during the final weeks of World War II. One sentence stood out more than anything else. Asterisk, he says he is finally ready to keep a promise he has carried since 1945. Asterisk, a promise. The same word written on the back of the photograph. "If only one returns, tell our families." The article continued. James had visited several families after returning from Europe. Some had lost sons. Others had lost brothers. He believed every family deserved to hear what had happened from someone who had actually been there. My heart began pounding. If he had visited all those families, then he had eventually come to ours. Exactly as my father remembered. The archivist pointed toward a handwritten note clipped beside the newspaper. It listed the names of every family James intended to visit after returning home. There were 8 names. The last one on the list, Eleanor Whitmore, my grandmother. The visit hadn't been random. He had spent nearly 4 decades searching for the courage to fulfill the promise he made beside Thomas in that wartime photograph. Suddenly, my grandmother's words echoed in my mind once again. Some promises arrived too late. I asked the archivist whether James had left behind any interviews. She smiled sadly. Just one. She disappeared once more into the storage room. When she returned, she carried an old cassette tape inside a protective case. The label simply read, James Callahan, Veterans Oral History Project, recorded 1991. My pulse quickened. She explained that volunteers had transferred the recording into a digital archive several years earlier to preserve it. If you're related to Thomas Whitmore, she said softly, I think you should hear this. She led me into a small listening room. The recording began with several seconds of silence. Then an elderly man's voice filled the room. Slow,
Calm.
heavy with memories. The first sentence he spoke made every hair on my arm stand up. I've spent 46 years trying to find the right words to tell Eleanor what really happened to Thomas. James's voice was older than I had imagined. It carried the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had spent a lifetime choosing his words carefully. There was no drama in the way he spoke. No attempt to make himself sound heroic. If anything, he sounded like someone who had waited too long to say what had lived inside him for decades. The interviewer asked a simple question. What do you remember most about Private Thomas Whitmore? James didn't answer immediately. Nearly 15 seconds passed before he finally spoke. I remember that he never stopped talking about home. The sentence was almost whispered. He carried a photograph of Eleanor in the breast pocket of his jacket. Every night he took it out, even if only for a few seconds. He'd smile, look at her face, and say, when this is over, I'm going to marry that girl. My throat tightened. I looked down at the photograph lying on the table beside me. The same young woman. The same smile. The interviewer asked if Thomas had ever seemed afraid. James let out a quiet laugh. We were all afraid. Another pause. But Thomas never let fear make him cruel. Even after everything we'd seen, he still believed people were worth saving. The recording continued. James described the final weeks of the war as complete chaos. Entire towns had been abandoned. Roads were clogged with refugees. Orders changed daily. No one knew where they would sleep from one night to the next. Then came the morning, everything changed. Their unit had been ordered to search a damaged farmhouse, where civilians had reportedly been hiding. As the soldiers approached, they heard voices inside. Children. Several families had taken shelter in the basement. Thomas volunteered to go first. He always did, James said quietly. He said children shouldn't have to see frightened soldiers pointing rifles at them. According to James, Thomas entered the farmhouse alone, speaking calmly so the families would know they were safe. Minutes later, someone outside opened fire. The interviewer interrupted. Enemy soldiers? James sighed deeply. We never found out. The gunfire erupted so suddenly that no one had time to react. Windows exploded. The walls shook. The entire front of the farmhouse collapsed in seconds. James stopped speaking. Only the sound of his breathing filled the recording. When he continued, his voice had changed. I still hear it. Another long silence. We dug for hours. The interviewer asked if they found Thomas immediately.
No.
His answer came almost instantly. He wasn't where we expected. Instead, they found something else first. The children. Every one of them.
Alive.
Hidden beneath broken beams that had somehow held long enough for the soldiers to reach them. James's voice cracked for the first time. Thomas had pushed every one of them into the cellar before the building came down. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, Thomas was no longer just a name written on an old envelope. He was a young man who had chosen strangers over himself. The interviewer asked the question I had been waiting for. Did you ever find him? James answered so softly I almost couldn't hear him. Yes. Then came the sentence that explained why he had spent 46 years searching for Eleanor. But before he died, he asked me to make one promise. The room was completely silent. Even the interviewer stopped asking questions. On the recording, all I could hear was James taking a slow, unsteady breath, as though he had relived that morning thousands of times and still hadn't found a way to carry it without pain. Finally, he spoke. I reached him just before the medics did. According to James, Thomas had been trapped beneath part of the collapsed staircase. The impact had crushed the heavy beams above him, leaving almost no chance of survival. Yet he wasn't calling for help. He wasn't asking if he would make it. His first words were about the children. Did they get out? James answered yes. Every single one of them. Only then did Thomas close his eyes for a moment. He smiled, James recalled. I'll never forget that smile. It wasn't the smile of someone who believed he was about to die. It was the smile of someone who had just learned that the people he had risked everything for were alive. The interviewer quietly asked whether Thomas said anything else. James nodded. Oh, yes. He reached into his jacket. Inside the breast pocket was the same photograph of Eleanor. The edges had become soft from being handled so often.
He looked at it one last time.
Then he handed it to James. He told me, if I don't make it home, don't let her spend her life wondering why I never came back. James's voice faltered. I promised him. He paused for several seconds before continuing. He also told me something I've never forgotten. The interviewer leaned forward. What was it? James answered almost in a whisper. He said, tell her I kept every promise I could. I felt tears running down my face before I even realized I was crying. For 78 years, my grandmother had believed Thomas had simply disappeared. She had never known that his final thoughts weren't about fear. They weren't about war. They weren't even about himself. They were about her. James explained that the fighting resumed before the recovery teams could properly identify everyone at the site. Records were lost. Units were reassigned. The final weeks of the war were filled with confusion unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Thomas was eventually listed as missing, not because no one cared, but because history sometimes moves faster than truth. The interviewer asked the question that had haunted me ever since finding the letter. If you promised him, why didn't you tell Eleanor sooner? James let out a long, weary sigh. I tried. Another silence. I wrote twice. No answer. I visited the address after the war. The family had moved. Years passed. Life happened. He married, raised children,
Worked.
retired, but he never forgot. I carried that photograph and his promise for 46 years. Then, after returning to Europe in 1983 and retracing the route of his old unit, he decided he couldn't wait any longer. He found Eleanor at last. And finally, he told her everything Thomas had asked him to say. The recording ended a few minutes later. There was no dramatic conclusion, no music, no final words meant to inspire anyone, only the quiet sound of an old man thanking the interviewer before the tape clicked to silence. I remained in that small listening room for a long time, unable to move. For the first time in my life, I understood why my grandmother had always left the room whenever someone mentioned the war. She hadn't been running from painful memories. She had been protecting the happiest ones. The archivist eventually knocked gently on the open door. I've seen many families listen to these recordings, she said softly. Everyone comes looking for answers. She hesitated. Sometimes they leave with something even more valuable. What is that? I asked.
Peace.
I wasn't sure I believed her. Not yet. As I gathered the letter, the diary, and the photograph, she handed me one final document. It was filed separately from the military records. The paper was yellow with age. Across the top, typed in faded black ink, were the words, Recommendation for Distinguished Service. The recommendation had been submitted only weeks after Thomas disappeared. It described his actions during the collapse of the farmhouse. According to witness statements, he knowingly entered an unstable building to evacuate civilians before enemy fire caused the structure to fail. Several soldiers confirmed that his actions directly saved the lives of 6 children and 2 adults. My eyes immediately searched for the final page. Instead of an approval, there was a handwritten note. Unable to process. Soldier officially listed as missing in action. Case suspended. Asterisk asterisk. I read it twice. Then a third time. Thomas had never received the recognition recommended by his commanding officers. Not because anyone believed he hadn't earned it. Because bureaucracy had swallowed his name. The war had ended. Units had been dissolved. Records misplaced. The recommendation simply disappeared into a filing cabinet somewhere. 78 years later, there it was, still waiting, almost exactly like the letter. 2 different pieces of history, both forgotten, both finally found. Before leaving the archive, I asked one last question. Did James ever know about this recommendation? The archivist slowly shook her head. As far as we know.
No.
That answer stayed with me during the drive home. I couldn't stop imagining what my grandmother would have felt if she had known. Thomas hadn't simply vanished. He had died saving innocent lives. And the world had almost forgotten. Almost. As I pulled into my driveway, I looked once more at the envelope resting on the passenger seat. For 78 years it had carried one man's final words across generations. But somehow, I had the feeling its journey still wasn't over. That night, I couldn't sleep. The letter rested on my bedside table. Beside it lay the photograph of Thomas, the diary, and the recommendation for a medal that had never been awarded. For the first time, I realized something strange. The letter had not arrived too late. It had arrived at the only moment when someone in the family was finally able to understand it. Had it reached my grandmother in 1945, it would have brought unbearable grief. Had it arrived while she was raising children, she might never have spoken of it. Instead, it had waited until every person directly involved was gone, leaving the responsibility to the next generation. The following morning, I decided to do something my grandmother had never been able to do. I searched for the families of the other two soldiers in the photograph. Daniel Mercer was the easiest to trace. His hometown historical society still maintained records of local veterans, and within a few hours I found an obituary published years earlier by his grandchildren. At the bottom was the name of his eldest daughter, Margaret Mercer.
She was still alive.
I hesitated before calling. How do you begin a conversation by telling someone you may have found a forgotten piece of their father's final days? When she answered, her voice sounded gentle but cautious. I introduced myself. Then I mentioned Thomas Whitmore. There was a long silence. I've heard that name before, she finally said. My father used to mention him. I told her about the letter, the photograph, James Callahan's recording, everything. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she quietly asked one question. Does the photograph show all three of them together? Yes. She began to cry. My father never had a single photograph from the war. I offered to send her a high-resolution copy. She thanked me several times before adding something unexpected. There may be something you should see. According to Margaret, her father had left behind a small wooden box containing wartime keepsakes. For decades, no one understood why he had guarded it so carefully. Inside was a notebook, not a diary, more like a collection of unfinished memories. One page, written shortly after the war ended, described Thomas. He was the kind of man who made everyone believe they would survive. Another page mentioned James. He carries promises heavier than anyone should. Then came one final sentence. If Eleanor ever learns the truth, tell her Thomas never felt alone. I closed my eyes. Neither Thomas nor James could have imagined that strangers separated by generations would someday connect those scattered fragments. One forgotten photograph, one delayed letter, one old recording, one unfinished notebook. Each piece alone meant very little. Together, they were rebuilding a story that history had quietly allowed to disappear. Margaret asked if I would be willing to visit. There may be one last thing in my father's box, she said. Something none of us have ever been able to explain. I agreed immediately. For the first time since opening the letter, it felt as though Thomas's story was still leading us somewhere. Margaret lived nearly 3 hours away. The drive gave me more time than I wanted to think. Every mile seemed to connect another piece of a story that had been scattered across nearly 8 decades. I kept replaying James's voice in my mind. Asterisk, tell her I kept every promise I could. Asterisk. By the time I reached Margaret's home, I no longer felt like I was investigating a mystery. I felt like I had become part of it. She welcomed me warmly. Her home was modest, filled with photographs of children, grandchildren, and shelves lined with books. On one wall hung a large framed portrait of her father, Daniel Mercer, wearing the same gentle smile I had seen in the tiny photograph Thomas carried into the war. She noticed me staring. That's the only formal military picture we ever had, she said. It was taken before he shipped overseas. We sat at her dining table while she brought out the wooden box she had mentioned over the phone. Unlike my grandmother's cedar chest, this one was much smaller. Its corners were worn smooth from years of handling. It stayed in my father's closet for as long as I can remember, she explained. He never locked it, but he never let anyone open it either. After he passed away, Margaret simply couldn't bring herself to go through its contents. Until now. Inside were ordinary keepsakes, a military compass, a rusted pocket knife, several service ribbons, a faded deck of playing cards. Nothing unusual. Then she carefully lifted a false wooden bottom hidden beneath the box. Neither of us had known it was there. Underneath rested a single folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a map. The paper had become so fragile that we unfolded it together, afraid it might tear. Across the center ran a hand-drawn route through a small German village. Several buildings had been sketched in pencil. One of them had been circled. Beside it, Thomas had written only 4 words. Asterisk, if anything happens here. Asterisk. Margaret looked at me. I've never seen this before. Neither had I. On the back of the map, another note appeared. The handwriting belonged to James. Asterisk, recovered after the collapse. Could never bring myself to throw it away. Asterisk. I felt a chill run through me. James had carried this map home after the war. Not because it held military value, because it marked the exact place where Thomas had spent his final moments. Margaret quietly reached back into the box. There was one more thing. She removed a small cloth pouch tied with faded string. Inside rested a silver ring. Simple, scratched, worn smooth by years of use. There was an inscription inside.
E&T.
Margaret looked at me with tears forming in her eyes. My father wrote one sentence about this. She handed me a tiny note folded around the ring. I unfolded it carefully. Asterisk, Thomas asked me to return this when the war was over. Asterisk, he never had the chance. James never found Eleanor until decades later. And somehow, the ring had remained hidden inside Daniel's box all along. Not because anyone wanted to keep it, because no one knew it was there. The letter had not been the only thing that had finally completed its journey after 78 years. Thomas's last promise had been waiting there too. I held the ring in the palm of my hand for a long time. It wasn't expensive. There were no diamonds. No elaborate design. Just a simple silver band that 2 young people in love had chosen sometime before the war changed everything. Inside, the tiny engraving had survived almost perfectly.
E&T.
Eleanor and Thomas. For nearly 8 decades, that little ring had rested in silence, hidden beneath a false compartment in a wooden box that no one had thought to examine closely. Margaret gently wiped a tear from her cheek. My father must never have known it was here. I nodded. Daniel had probably tucked it away after the war, intending to return it someday. Life moved on. He started a family, built a career, grew old, and the hidden compartment slowly became part of the box itself. Generations passed without anyone realizing one final promise was still waiting inside. Margaret looked at me. I think this belongs to your family. I immediately shook my head.
No.
She seemed surprised. It belongs to both of our families. Without Daniel, without James, without Thomas, none of us would be sitting here today. The ring wasn't simply a keepsake anymore. It had become part of all of our histories. That afternoon we continued searching through Daniel's notebook together. Most pages described ordinary moments of military life. Cold mornings, long marches, shared meals, the endless waiting that soldiers rarely spoke about after returning home. But one entry caught my attention immediately. It had no date, only a title, The Promise. Daniel wrote that the night before the photograph was taken, the 3 friends had made an unusual agreement. If any one of them survived, he would visit the families of the other 2, not to deliver medals, not to bring official reports, simply to tell them the truth. So no mother, Daniel had written, would spend the rest of her life wondering whether her son died alone. I felt my throat tighten. History often records battles. It records dates, victories, defeats. What it almost never records are promises like these. 3 frightened young men, barely adults, making one last pact beneath a sky filled with uncertainty. Then another detail appeared. According to Daniel's notes, Thomas had laughed before they shook hands. "If we're lucky," he had said, "none of us will have to keep this promise." None of them knew that only James would return, and that even he would need nearly 40 years to find the courage to fulfill it. As the afternoon faded into evening, Margaret disappeared into another room. When she returned, she carried an old photo album. I almost forgot. She carefully turned several pages until she found a photograph taken in 1983. An elderly James Callahan stood beside an elderly Daniel Mercer. The two old friends were smiling at the camera. On the back someone had written, *The last reunion. *. My eyes immediately searched the picture for one more face. There was an empty chair between them. No one sat there. Yet resting on that chair was a single white envelope, addressed to Eleanor Whitmore. James and Daniel had taken that photograph after finally locating my grandmother. Even without Thomas beside them, they had saved him a place. I couldn't stop looking at that photograph. Two elderly men stood side by side, both wearing small veterans' pins on their jackets. Time had turned their hair white and their shoulders slightly bent, but their expressions carried the quiet relief of men who had finally fulfilled a promise that had followed them for almost 40 years. Between them sat an empty wooden chair. No one occupied it, yet it was impossible not to notice. Resting carefully on the seat was a white envelope. Margaret smiled faintly when she saw where my eyes had settled. My father always insisted that chair wasn't empty. I looked at her. He said Thomas was there. The words sent a chill through me. Neither James nor Daniel had forgotten him. Not after 1 year. Not after 10. Not even after nearly 4 decades. To them, the promise they had made as young soldiers had never truly ended. Margaret turned another page in the album. Tucked inside was a folded receipt from a small photography studio. The date matched the reunion picture. On the back, written in James's handwriting, was a short note. *We finally found her. No explanation. No names. Just 5 simple words. It struck me that James had probably carried enormous guilt for decades. Not because he had broken his promise, but because it had taken him so long to keep it. As the afternoon faded into evening, Margaret prepared coffee while I continued reading Daniel's notebook. Near the final pages, I found one last memory about Thomas. It wasn't about battle. It wasn't about heroism. It was about kindness. Daniel wrote that whenever supplies arrived, Thomas always checked whether everyone else had received theirs before opening his own package. If someone had no family sending letters, Thomas would share his. If someone had no photographs from home, Thomas would pull out Eleanor's picture and say, "Until you get one of your own, she's everyone's reminder that there's still something worth going home for." I had to stop reading. That single sentence revealed more about Thomas than any military report ever could. He wasn't remembered because he had died bravely. He was remembered because of the kind of man he had chosen to be every ordinary day before that. Before leaving, Margaret placed the silver ring back into the small cloth pouch. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "My father spent his whole life protecting these memories." She handed the pouch to me. "I think it's your turn now." I accepted it carefully. Not as an inheritance, as a responsibility. During the drive home, the sun began to set. The ring rested on the passenger seat beside the letter that had crossed 78 years to find us. I suddenly realized something remarkable. For decades, everyone believed Thomas's story had ended in 1945. But that wasn't true. His story had continued quietly through James, through Daniel, through my grandmother, through every unopened box and forgotten photograph. And now, somehow, it had reached me. What I didn't know yet was that one final discovery was still waiting. Not inside another box. Not inside another diary. But inside the courthouse records of my own hometown, where a forgotten document had remained untouched since 1946, carrying Thomas Whitmore's name on a page no one in our family had ever seen. The courthouse had stood in the center of town for more than a century. I had driven past it hundreds of times without ever thinking about what rested inside its basement archives. To me, It was simply another old brick building where people filed paperwork, recorded deeds, and settled legal matters. I never imagined it would hold the final missing piece of Thomas Whitmore's story. A county clerk greeted me kindly when I explained that I was researching my family's history. When I mentioned Thomas's full name, she searched several databases before frowning. There isn't much. I wasn't surprised. Missing soldiers often disappeared into incomplete records after the war. Then she paused. There is one document. It wasn't military. It wasn't even federal. It had been filed with the county in 1946. She disappeared into the archive room and returned carrying a thin folder tied with faded cotton ribbon. Unlike the military files, this one had barely been touched. The paper inside remained almost perfectly preserved. Across the top appeared the title, Petition for Legal Declaration of Death. I felt my chest tighten. This was the paperwork families were forced to complete when a missing soldier could no longer be located. Without it, estates could not be settled. Property could not be transferred. Life could not legally move forward. The petitioner was listed as Eleanor Whitmore, not his wife, his fiancée. I had known they had officially announced their engagement. Neither had anyone else in my family. According to the document, Eleanor had waited nearly a full year after the war ended before signing it. The attached statement was handwritten. She explained that Thomas had been listed as missing in action for many months and that military authorities had advised the family there was almost no hope of receiving further information. Then came the final paragraph. I do not sign this because I believe Thomas Whitmore is forgotten. I sign this because I believe he would never ask me to stop living. I stared at those words for a long time. They sounded almost identical to the request Thomas had written in his final letter. Asterisk, please don't spend your life waiting if I never come home. Asterisk. Neither of them had abandoned the other. They had each tried, in their own way, to free the other from guilt. The clerk quietly placed another sheet beside the petition. It was folded inside. It wasn't an official form.
It was a personal note.
And signed. Never mailed. Never filed anywhere else. Apparently, someone had tucked it into the folder decades earlier. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. If you ever return, whether in life, or only through someone's memory, know that I kept my promise too. I felt tears welling in my eyes once again. She never expected Thomas to read those words. She simply needed to write them, to place them somewhere beside his name, perhaps hoping that, somehow, they would one day find each other. As I carefully returned the papers to the folder, the clerk smiled softly. You know,
she said,
in all my years working here, I don't think anyone has ever asked to see this file. For 78 years, Thomas Whitmore had waited quietly inside forgotten archives, not asking to be remembered, only waiting for someone to finally come looking. I left the courthouse carrying only a few photocopies, yet somehow they felt heavier than everything else I had found over the past several days. The letter, the diary, the photograph, the silver ring, James's recording, Daniel's notebook. Now Eleanor's final message. Each discovery had answered one question while quietly asking another. As I drove home, I kept thinking about something the county clerk had said. No one has ever asked to see this file. For nearly 80 years, Thomas's name had rested inside that building. Not hidden, simply forgotten. That thought stayed with me until I pulled into my driveway. Instead of going inside, I sat in the car for several minutes. Then I made a decision. This story belonged to more people than just my family. The following week, I contacted the local Veterans Museum. The director answered personally. When I explained everything we had uncovered, he listened without interrupting. Only once did he stop me. You said you have the original letter? Yes. And the recommendation for distinguished service? Yes. There was a long silence. Finally he said, I think you should bring everything. 2 days later, I spread every document across a large conference table inside the museum's archive room. Historians, military researchers, archivists, postal historians. One by one, they examined each piece. No one spoke very much. The room remained unusually quiet, not because the documents were dramatic, because they were authentic. The faded ink, the wartime paper, the military stamps. Everything matched the period perfectly. One elderly historian gently lifted Thomas's letter beneath a protective sheet. "This," he whispered, "isn't just family history. It's American history." Another researcher spent nearly an hour examining the military recommendation. When he finally looked up, his expression had completely changed. "I've seen cases like this before." He explained that during the final weeks of World War II, administrative records were often lost as units moved rapidly across Europe. Recommendations for medals sometimes disappeared before reaching headquarters, especially when the soldier had been listed as missing in action. He turned a document toward me. This recommendation was never rejected. It was never processed. Those words struck me harder than I expected. Thomas hadn't been denied recognition. History had simply misplaced it. The museum director folded his hands. "I believe there's enough documentation here to request an official review." I wasn't sure I understood. "A review?" He nodded. "In rare cases, the Army reopens forgotten recommendations." I stared at him. "Even after all these years?" He smiled. "Especially after all these years." For the first time since opening that envelope, I realized the story wasn't only about looking backward. It might still change something today. Not for Thomas. Not for Eleanor. They no longer needed recognition. But for every future generation carrying their name, the truth was finally beginning to find its place. The museum director wasn't making promises. He explained that reopening a military recommendation after nearly 8 decades was uncommon. It required documentation, eyewitness testimony when available, official records, and enough independent evidence to establish exactly what had happened. For the first time, we had all of those pieces. Not because someone had planned for them to survive, because dozens of ordinary people had unknowingly preserved them. My grandmother had saved the diary. James had recorded his testimony. Daniel had kept the map and the ring. The county courthouse had preserved Eleanor's petition. The Postal Service had finally delivered Thomas's last letter. Each person had protected one small fragment. None of them realized they were safeguarding the same story. The historians began scanning every document using archival equipment. Nothing was rushed. Cotton gloves, protective sleeves, high-resolution cameras. Every faded line of ink was preserved digitally before anyone touched the originals again. Watching them work filled me with an unexpected sense of gratitude. For 78 years, these papers had quietly survived floods, moves, forgotten boxes, and changing generations. Now they were finally being treated as something valuable. One historian stopped while examining the wartime photograph. He enlarged it on a computer screen. "Look here." He pointed toward Thomas's uniform. At first I didn't notice anything unusual. Then he zoomed in further. Pinned just above Thomas's left pocket was a tiny metal badge. The historian smiled. "I thought so." He explained that it wasn't a decoration. It identified soldiers who had completed emergency civilian rescue training before being deployed overseas. Thomas hadn't simply reacted bravely that day inside the farmhouse. He had been trained to protect civilians whenever possible. Suddenly, James's story made even more sense. Thomas hadn't entered the building because he wanted to be remembered as a hero. He entered because helping frightened families had become part of who he was. Another researcher interrupted. "We found something." Everyone gathered around another monitor. Using military movement records, they had reconstructed the route of Thomas's unit during April 1945. The hand-drawn map found inside Daniel's wooden box matched the official military maps almost perfectly. The circled farmhouse still appeared on wartime engineering reports. It wasn't just a memory.
It was a real location.
One that still existed. Damaged. Renovated. Eventually rebuilt. But still standing. The museum director looked toward me. "You know," he smiled gently, "people visit famous battlefields every year."
He pointed toward the map.
"But almost nobody knows about this place. This is where one soldier chose 6 children over his own life." The room fell silent. No one needed to say anything else. History isn't always changed by generals. Sometimes, It's changed by one quiet decision made inside a collapsing farmhouse. As the meeting ended, the director handed me a folder. Inside was a copy of the official requests they were preparing to send to the Department of the Army. Across the top appeared a title I never imagined I would read. Request for Posthumous Recognition, Private Thomas Whitmore. The letter that had finally arrived after 78 years had already accomplished something extraordinary. It hadn't only reunited one family with its past. It had given history one more chance to remember a man it had accidentally left behind. Several months passed. Life slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but not a single day went by without me thinking about Thomas. Sometimes I wondered how many other stories like his were still hidden inside forgotten boxes, unopened drawers, or dusty archives, waiting for someone willing to ask one more question. Then, one crisp autumn morning, my phone rang. It was the museum director. I could hear excitement in his voice before he even introduced himself. They answered. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The Army completed its review. I sat down at the kitchen table. What did they say? They confirmed everything. The investigation had taken months. Military historians compared battlefield reports, postal records, engineering maps, eyewitness testimony, unit diaries, even aerial photographs taken during the final weeks of the war. Every independent source pointed toward the same conclusion. Private Thomas Whitmore had entered the farmhouse voluntarily. He remained inside after discovering civilians trapped beneath the lower floor. Instead of escaping when the first shots were fired, he continued helping children reach the cellar. His actions directly saved multiple lives. The recommendation written in 1945 had never been rejected. It had simply disappeared during the confusion that followed Germany's surrender. The museum director paused. They're restoring it. I closed my eyes. After 78 years, history was correcting one forgotten mistake. A formal ceremony would be held several weeks later. Not because medals change the past, but because truth deserves a place in the future. Representatives from the Army, local officials, veterans organizations, the Historical Society, even descendants of the civilians rescued that day in Germany had been invited after researchers successfully located several surviving families. One elderly woman, now in her 80s, sent a handwritten letter. She had been one of the children hiding inside that farmhouse. She remembered almost nothing about the attack. Only one image. A smiling American soldier telling us not to be afraid. She never learned his name. Until now. When I read her letter, I couldn't help imagining Thomas exactly as James had described him.
Calm.
Gentle. Thinking about frightened children instead of himself. The ceremony itself was simple. No grand speeches. No dramatic music. Only quiet respect. When Thomas's name was called, I stepped forward carrying the same envelope that had finally reached our family after 78 years. Beside me stood Margaret Mercer, representing Daniel. Across the aisle sat James Callahan's grandchildren, representing the man who had spent almost half a century trying to keep one promise. 3 families, still connected, just as 3 young soldiers had once promised they always would be. As the medal was presented posthumously, I didn't feel sadness. I felt gratitude. Not because Thomas had finally received recognition, because the people who loved him no longer existed only inside fading memories. They had become part of history again. After the ceremony, people didn't rush to leave. No one seemed eager to break the quiet that had settled over the room. Families spoke in soft voices. Veterans stood together, exchanging stories only they could fully understand. Children wandered through the museum exhibit, stopping to look at photographs that had suddenly become more than old pieces of paper. One display case had been prepared especially for Thomas. Inside rested the original envelope. Beside it lay the photograph of the 3 soldiers. The silver ring. A copy of Eleanor's diary. James's recorded testimony played through headphones for anyone who wished to listen. Watching strangers stop in front of that display affected me more than I expected. They didn't know Thomas. They had never heard of Eleanor. Yet many of them stood there much longer than they had planned. Some quietly wiped away tears. Others simply nodded before moving on. It reminded me that certain stories don't belong only to one family. They belong to anyone who has ever loved someone and waited. As the museum slowly emptied, the director approached me carrying a small envelope. "This arrived yesterday," he said. "It's addressed to you." The return address was in Germany. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter from the granddaughter of one of the children Thomas had saved inside the farmhouse. She explained that her grandmother had passed away only a few weeks before the ceremony. Before her death, she asked the family to write one final letter if Thomas's relatives were ever found. I unfolded the pages. "My grandmother rarely spoke about the war," it began. "But every birthday she would tell us the same story. She described an American soldier kneeling beside frightened children in a dark cellar. He smiled at them. He promised everything would be all right. Then he disappeared into the dust above. For decades, her grandmother never knew whether that soldier survived. She simply believed someone somewhere had raised a good man." Near the end of the letter came a sentence that brought tears to my eyes. "Because of Thomas Whitmore, our family exists." The writer listed the generations that followed. Her grandmother, her mother, herself, her own children, 7 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren, more than 30 people. Every one of them alive because one young soldier made a decision in a collapsing farmhouse. I folded the letter slowly. For 78 years, my family had wondered what became of Thomas. Now another family had spent those same 78 years unknowingly living because of him. History has a remarkable way of connecting lives that never meet. The museum director quietly placed a hand on my shoulder. "I think Thomas would have liked knowing that." I smiled. "So do I." For the first time since the envelope arrived, it finally felt like every promise had found its way home. A week after the ceremony, I returned to my grandmother's house alone. It had been empty since her passing. The furniture remained exactly where she had left it. The curtains still carried the faint scent of lavender she loved so much. For years, walking through those rooms had filled me with sadness. This time, it felt different. I carried only one small box. Inside were the few things that had completed their impossible journey across 78 years. Thomas's final letter, the silver ring, a copy of the restored military recommendation, and a photograph taken at the ceremony. I placed them carefully on the old dining table where my grandmother had once served Sunday dinners. Then I opened the diary one last time. There was something I had overlooked. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded piece of paper so thin it had almost become part of the binding itself. It wasn't dated. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It appeared to be nothing more than a few thoughts Eleanor had written late in life. The handwriting was slower than in the earlier entries, more fragile. "If anyone ever finds these pages, please don't feel sorry for me." I stopped reading for a moment. She continued, "I was loved. Some people spend their whole lives searching for that. I was fortunate enough to experience it twice." Those words caught me completely by surprise. For decades, I had quietly wondered whether my grandmother had spent the rest of her life trapped between two loves. Now she answered the question herself. "I loved Thomas. I loved Robert. They were different men. They gave me different lives. I would not erase either." It was one of the wisest things I had ever read. She had never seen love as something divided. She saw it as something that continued to grow, even after heartbreak. The final paragraph was only a few lines long. When people ask about the war, they think the story is about death. It never was. It was always about the people who chose kindness while surrounded by hatred. I quietly closed the diary. In that single sentence, my grandmother had summarized everything I had spent weeks discovering. Thomas had not become unforgettable because he died. He became unforgettable because of how he lived before that moment arrived. I looked around the silent house. For the first time, it no longer felt like a place holding unanswered questions. It felt like a home that had finally finished telling its story. As I locked the front door, I carried the box with me, not because the memories belonged hidden inside another attic or another cedar chest, but because stories like Thomas and Eleanor's deserve to keep traveling, Just like one remarkable letter that refused to give up until it finally reached the family it had always been meant for. Several months have passed since that extraordinary letter found its way into my hands. Life has returned to its familiar rhythm. I still make coffee every morning. I still check the mailbox without thinking. I still drive past the old courthouse and the museum from time to time. But I no longer see them the same way. Because now I know that history doesn't always disappear. Sometimes, it simply waits. It waits inside forgotten filing cabinets. Inside dusty attics. Inside old wooden boxes no one has opened for decades. And sometimes, it waits inside the heart of someone who has carried a promise for an entire lifetime. People often ask me what surprised me most about everything that happened. Was it the letter? The ring? The diary? The medal? The answer is no. What surprised me most was discovering how many ordinary people quietly protected one man's story without ever realizing it. My grandmother preserved her memories. James protected his promise. Daniel unknowingly safeguarded the ring and the map. Archivists preserved forgotten records. Postal workers refused to throw away an undelivered letter. Historians cared enough to reopen a file everyone else had forgotten. Each person carried only one small piece. Together, they preserved an entire life. Sometimes we imagine history belongs only to presidents, generals, famous inventors, or great leaders. But after everything I've learned, I no longer believe that. History also belongs to quiet people, to school teachers, to farmers, to mothers, to soldiers whose names almost disappeared, to young women who waited faithfully before finding the strength to live again, to old friends who spent 40 years keeping one impossible promise. Thomas Whitmore never became famous. His name never appeared in history books. Most people will never hear it. Yet because of one decision he made inside a collapsing farmhouse, entire generations exist today. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Families were born. Lives were lived. Dreams became possible. Not because someone sought glory, because one ordinary man chose compassion over fear. Whenever I think about my grandmother now, I no longer picture the sadness she carried. I picture something else. I imagine an elderly woman quietly smiling after James finally knocked on her door. At last. She knew. Thomas hadn't forgotten her. He hadn't abandoned his promise. He had kept every promise he possibly could. And perhaps that knowledge allowed her heart to rest for the first time since the spring of 1945. The original letter now rests inside a climate-controlled archive at the museum. Not because it belongs behind glass, but because stories like this deserve to survive another 100 years. Maybe one day a child visiting that exhibit will stop in front of the faded envelope and ask, "Who is Thomas Whitmore?" Someone will answer, "He was an ordinary young man who did an extraordinary thing." And perhaps that child will leave believing something our world desperately needs to remember. Kindness is never wasted. Promises matter. Love can outlive war. And sometimes, even after 78 years, a letter can still arrive exactly when it is needed most. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing Thomas, Eleanor, James, and Daniel's story to live once more. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel. There are countless forgotten true stories still waiting to be told, and perhaps the next one will remind us once again that history is not only made by famous names, but by ordinary people whose courage quietly changed the world forever.